Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Metro United Way's 19th Beyond Buzzwords Speaker Series. I'm especially honored to gather with you during Black History Month, a time to celebrate Black achievement and leadership while also reflecting on the work still needed to advance economic equity in our community. I am Adria Johnson, President and CEO of Metro United Way. Today's conversation, Reckoning with Wealth Inequality, speaks directly to why Beyond Buzzwords exist. This series was created as a platform to bring together bold thinkers who move us beyond awareness and toward meaningful action, especially when it comes to addressing the systems that shape opportunity and financial stability. This discussion reflects that purpose through the work of Dorothy A. Brown. In The Whiteness of Wealth, Professor Brown helps us understand how tax and economic systems, often viewed as neutral, have contributed to racial disparities in income, home ownership, and generational wealth. Her research brings critical awareness to how these policies have widened the racial wealth gap over time. Her newest book, Getting to Reparations, moves that conversation forward by challenging us to think about accountability, repair, and the actions needed to help close the racial wealth gap and build more equitable systems for future generations. That progression from awareness to action mirrors Metro United Way's From Hardship to Hope campaign. Across our 7-county region, 21% of families struggle to afford basic needs like housing, food, childcare, and transportation. We know these challenges do not impact all families equally, and closing the racial wealth gap is essential to ensuring long-term stability and opportunity across the greater Louisville region. Our goal is to lift 260,000 people from hardship to hope by 2030. Achieving that goal means expanding access to education, career pathways, financial resources, and support systems that help families build stability and generational wealth. Black History Month reminds us that progress has always required both truth and action. Professor Brown's work challenges us to understand how inequities were created while inspiring us to be part of the solution. I would also like to thank the LG&E-KU Foundation for their generous support of the Beyond Buzzwords Speaker Series this past year. Thank you so much for joining us today to learn from Professor Brown's scholarship and advocacy to help illuminate the path toward real impact and to join us in building a more equitable community. Now, please join me in welcoming Trent Finley, Director of Equitable Community here at Metro United Way, who will introduce our featured speaker and serve as moderator for today's important conversation.
Thank you, Adria. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to introduce our featured speaker. Dorothy A. Brown currently holds the Martin D. Ginsburg Chair in Taxation at Georgetown Law and is a nationally recognized expert on race, wealth, and tax policy. She is the author of The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It, and the forthcoming Getting to Reparations, How Building a Different America Requires a Reckoning with Our Past. That was actually published just recently, January 20th, I believe, Professor Brown. A leading voice in examining how tax policy shapes economic inequality, Brown's research challenges long-standing assumptions that fairness in the U.S. tax system is and highlights the structural barriers that contribute to the racial wealth gap. Prior to joining Georgetown Law, she served on the faculty at Emory University School of Law and has held academic appointments at several prestigious institutions throughout her career. Brown's work has reached national audiences through appearances on ABC's The View, MSNBC's Ali Velshi Show, New Yorker Radio Hour, NPR's Marketplace, and PBS NewsHour. Her thought leadership has also been featured in major publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and The Atlantic, where she continues to influence public dialogue on equity, economic justice, and policy reform. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Professor Dorothy A. Brown.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And just so the audience knows, before we signed on here, she graciously said that we could call her Dorothy. So I will do that. And so I want to start with The Whiteness of Wealth. In that book, you examined how tax policy widened the racial wealth gap. By the end of that work, you concluded that even fixing the tax code today would not close the gap. That realization led to getting to reparations. So I want to start there. When you realized reform was not enough, what did you see that made reparations a necessary part of the conversation?
Well, I realized that even if every April 15th, until we fix our tax system, it strips wealth from Black Americans and transfers it into white Americans' hands, or I should say, white Americans' pockets. So even if we fix the tax system, it wouldn't fix the increasing racial wealth gap, the widening gulf that really has its roots in slavery and what came for Black Americans after slavery. So by the end of The Whiteness of Wealth, I realized even if we stopped the wealth stripping in our tax laws every April 15th, there were all these other systems for building wealth that strip wealth away from Black Americans. And I realized reparations was the only thing that would fix this, but I was a skeptic to reparations. I came to the idea of reparations thinking, oh, that's just something that people talk about. It's never going to happen. And then one afternoon, I was having coffee with a former colleague who mentioned in her foreign relations class, she teaches how the United States paid reparations to Italy on behalf of Italians lynched in Louisiana. And I said, wait a minute. The United States government paid reparations. They paid cash to Italy for people lynched, and it wasn't on behalf of Black Americans. And she said, yes. And we went on to whatever else we were talking about, but I never moved on. I realized that there was a history that I didn't know about. And was lynching the only example, or would I find others if I went looking? And surprise, surprise, I found others when I went looking.
Thank you. So a lot of Americans are taught that wealth gaps are about behavior, savings habits, financial literacy. What does your research show instead?
My research shows that when you control for income, Black Americans do better at saving than their white peers. And the research shows that if you're thinking, I hear financial literacy tossed around a lot, right? The reason why Black Americans don't have more savings is because we spend it on frivolous things, except the research shows the opposite. And if you think about it, there's no group of people who very economic lives depend on smart budgeting than low income Americans, right? So I, I when I approach the question, many people say, well, why is it that Black people are disproportionately poor? When really the question should be, why is poverty racialized the way it is? And why does poverty have so many Black people in it? The poverty net catches Black Americans because of systemic discrimination, things that are beyond our control. And this gets back into a bit of a history lesson in terms of how is it that we actually paid reparations to white enslavers with the DC Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862 to white enslavers when we freed Black Americans who were enslaved. No payment to Black Americans, but payments to white enslavers as compensation for them losing their property, right? Black people who were freed. So Black people are freed and they're giving nothing. We were told about this 40 acres and a mule, but that was taken back almost immediately. So we cannot be surprised when systemic discrimination carries over from generation to generation to generation when Black Americans were stripped of wealth. And then you see when Black Americans are actually able to build wealth, they were lynched and their property was taken, or eminent domain came up by the state and local government and stripped property away. So we see all of these government systems that are designed to take wealth away from Black Americans. In fact, we shouldn't be surprised that so many Black Americans don't have wealth. We should be surprised that there are any Black Americans with wealth at all, because it's a miracle in this system.
Yes, reframing the narrative.
Yes,
If
exactly.
we,
That's really what it is.
yeah, if we corrected tax policy today and made it fully equitable, why would that still not repair what has already been extracted?
Because it would stop the extraction on April 15th, but it wouldn't compensate for mass incarceration. It wouldn't compensate for property lost in lynching. It wouldn't compensate for the returning GI vets, the Black GI vets during World War II who were denied access to home loans. It wouldn't compensate for property that was stripped away from farmers, Black farmers by the USDA, agriculture, right? So we have a myriad, the system for building wealth in America has a myriad of ways of taking Black wealth away from Black Americans. So even if we fixed one system, which is the tax system, that'd be a good start, but it would just be a start. That's only one system when there are so many others that need repair.
Absolutely. Now let's move into your new book, Getting to Reparations. When you say reparations, what do you mean specifically? What does it look like in policy terms?
When I say reparations, I talk about cash plus. And the reason I talk about cash plus is because of what I just said. The system for building wealth in America is slanted towards whiteness. Therefore, if every Black American were given X dollars, I would argue within a few short years, those dollars would wind up building up white wealth because the system is tilted towards white wealth and it's tilted towards extracting Black resources. So my policy prescription is reparations, which would include cash, but it would also include systemic reform. It would it would reimagine how we fund K through 12. It would reimagine how homeowners build up equity because today, depending on the race of your neighbors, determines whether or not your house is going to be a good financial investment. What if we didn't make the race of your neighbors the bellwether for whether or not your home appreciated in value, but basically said, oh, homes in white neighborhoods appreciate to that extent, then all the Black homeowners in comparable neighborhoods would be guaranteed the same rate of return. So it's really about reimagining what equality would look like if actually Black Americans had access to equal rights.
Is reparations primarily an economic policy or is it a moral reckoning?
So I argue, because it's the tax lawyer in me, that this is about economics, but you cannot understand the history of the treatment of Black people in America without moral outrage, right? So I think it's both. I think and I talk about this, what happened to Black Americans after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. So the 13th Amendment liberated us from slavery. The 14th Amendment gave us equal citizenship rights. The 15th Amendment gave us the right to vote. But just because those constitutional amendments were passed didn't mean Black people actually were free from slavery. Black people had equal rights. In fact, after those amendments were passed, we got separate but equal validated by the United States Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson. So what I talk about in the book is if we were freed and white supremacy left us alone, we wouldn't need to ask for reparations. The problem is white supremacy could not leave us alone. You could not leave us alone to build our wealth and take care of our families. You had to strip the wealth from us. You had to make it impossible for us to build wealth. So when I think of reparations, I think of the need for systemic reform because here we are in 2026 and these systems are operating pretty expertly at stripping wealth from Black Americans.
Yes. Now, the elephant in the room. Ms. Dorothy, what is the biggest misunderstanding people have about reparations?
The biggest misunderstanding that people have about reparations, I think, is a misunderstanding of our history. So, a typical complaint you hear is, why are you still talking about something that happened so long ago? When what you realize, if you actually understand history, is while chattel slavery may have ended with the 13th Amendment, slavery just shapeshifted. It became mass incarceration through state laws like vagrancy, which made being unemployed illegal and allowed states to target Black men for arrest if they were unemployed. You would find out about convict leasing. You would find out about sundown towns. You would find out about, as I said before, GI veterans fighting against fascism and white supremacy in Europe and coming back home and being subject to white supremacy in the United States. They didn't have equal access to the GI Bill. They couldn't get a home loan insured through FHA insurance. So the policies that built up and created a white middle class after World War II were specifically denied to Black Americans. So I think the biggest misconception is people don't know our history. They don't know our very sordid history of legal discrimination against Black Americans.
Thank you. For several years, Ms. Dorothy, we have a simulated learning tool. It's called the Racial Wealth Gap Simulation that has, I believe, opened up people's eyes. You mentioned the GI Bill. You've mentioned a couple of policy, mass incarceration. What historical policies do you believe make the case strongest?
You know, it's funny. I commissioned a focus group, a political strategy firm, to focus group test reparations to see which messages would resonate. And there were two messages that resonate with opponents to convert them to become supporters. One message is what I just talked about is understanding the history. Most people don't understand that in the 1950s, Black Americans could still be discriminated against on the basis of race and it was legal. But the other thing that people didn't know about is we have a history in the United States of paying reparations. I mentioned paying Italy on behalf of Italians lynched in Louisiana. And I mentioned the DC Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862, which compensated white enslavers. But I didn't get a chance to mention the Indian Claims Commission, which compensated tribal nations for land theft and economic exploitation, as well as Japanese American reparations for mass incarceration. So when people, during World War II, when people understand we've done it before, they start to think, oh, well, maybe it's not impossible. And then the second, I'd say the second of all of the history that we conveyed to the focus group members, the one that outraged them the most was the GI Bill being denied to Black returning World War II veterans. I mean, people were outraged when they heard about that. They didn't know about it. And when they heard about it, that was one of the things that resonated with more people than anything else. They were just outraged that people could fight for our country and come back and be denied rights that they were fighting for others.
Agreed. For employers and institutions that are in this virtual room here, as well as our staff here in person, who may not control federal policy, what responsibility do they have in reckoning with wealth inequality?
So if we're talking about state and local governments, well, I'll talk about state and local governments, then I'll talk about corporations, then I could talk about funders, right? So state and local governments are part of the problem in the sense that they have a history of discriminatory behavior, whether it's lynchings that were not prosecuted, whether it's sundown towns that denied access to Black Americans other than to work there and leave, whether it's eminent domain. We see California taking responsibility for what they did to the Bruces with respect to Bruce's Beach, right? So there are things that state and local governments can do without waiting for the federal government. And we see a lot of state and local governments forming reparations commissions, paying reparations, like in Evanston, Illinois. So we see some progress being made and not waiting for the federal government. With respect to corporations, corporations are implicated in this. And I would suggest corporations do their own excavation work around their history. So I talked about convict leasing. Well, one of the companies, or the precursor to the company of U.S. Steel, they rented they rented those who were imprisoned to help build their wealth. So you actually have companies existing today that profited off of discriminatory behavior that they engaged in with respect to Black Americans. So each corporation today, if they are a successor corporation or they were around in the 20th century, they've got, I would call it, blood on their hands. They've got some involvement in what chattel slavery shapeshifted into. I could talk about educational institutions. A lot of educational institutions were built with enslaved hands, and they had faculty members who taught white supremacy as the only way to view history. And when we think about funders, what are people funding? So you really want to ask the question, are you funding programs that you funded for decades that have not moved the needle? You keep funding the same thing that's not working. Are you using a different approach? And of course, funders have funded things that contributed toward the racial wealth gap, increasing the racial wealth gap as well. So honestly, there isn't a sector that can escape scrutiny for having been part of the exploitation of Black Americans. And I talk about this in the book, every sector imaginable has a role to play. And they can start with themselves. If you're in the tech industry, we can think about the tech industry and how exploitative algorithms are in extracting and racially profiling and extracting wealth from Black Americans. The tech industry can start with itself. The finance industry that has excluded Black entrepreneurs can start. So there isn't an industry that doesn't have work to be done. And we don't have to sit around and wait for the federal government to begin that reparative work.
What would accountability look like at the local level?
At the local level, it would look like starting a reparations commission. It would look like doing the homework, doing the hard work of figuring out what history was like in your city 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and what role the government played and what policies are in place today that can be reformed. I could think of property taxes as one example, right? How is it that because research shows that Black Americans pay a higher percentage of their home value in property taxes than white Americans. Well, that should not be the case. What are local property tax assessors doing to make this a fairer process? So there are actually lots of things that can occur at the local level. I could point out Evanston, Illinois as one example of a local community that did a study, talked about reparations, and then enacted reparations.
What does it take for America to actually have this conversation honestly?
So I think, and I advocate for this in my book, a commission to study. We've never studied the aftermath of slavery. We've never studied the roots of building wealth in America after the Civil War and why Black Americans were unable to build wealth and why white Americans were able to build wealth through government policies. So a commission that I argue would be created by presidential executive order with the next Democrat elected president on day one should sign an executive order creating a reparations commission to study. And within 3 years, a recommendation would be made and the legislation could be enacted by Congress. Now, this commission is going to have to do work no other commission has ever done. This commission, in addition to holding hearings and getting data and research and collecting testimony, which all the others did, this commission has to also build public support because we're not getting a bill out of Congress without moving the serious public opposition that we face today. And part of why I did the focus group testing was to see, because as you mentioned earlier, messaging is really important, was to see what kind of messaging moves the needle, such that a commission could take that messaging in a publicly televised hearing and move the needle. So what it's going to take is increased public support. It's going to take bold leadership, and it's going to take starting the process by creating a commission to study.
If we do nothing, what does the racial wealth gap look like in 50 years?
If we do nothing, not only does the racial wealth gap grow, we will be in a situation where people will stop believing in the American dream. And I think it'll happen before 50 years. And anarchy is the word that comes to mind. What society looks like when your typical Black middle class American realizes there's no point in working in this system because it's not for my benefit. People talk about the cost of paying reparations, but they don't talk about the cost of doing nothing. Because the cost of doing nothing is very, very serious. Because right now we're in a system where wealth is being transferred to billionaires from everybody. And that is not a sustainable system. So, from my perspective, doing nothing will lead to more chaos, and it will happen much quicker than 50 years. And people need to think about the consequences when your average conservative, and I say conservative small c, Black American who believes you work hard, the system, you have to work twice as hard. We know that, right? But we work twice as hard, and the system should enable us to do better and should enable my children to do better than I do. And at this moment, no, we are finding people very disillusioned, and that disillusionment, I think, will lead to more chaos, and we won't get to 50 years looking the way we look now.
Absolutely. I have two more questions, and then we're going to move to some audience questions as well. But how do you respond to people who say that they didn't personally cause these harms?
I love that question. And I wrote the book with them in mind because their grandparents benefited from FHA insurance my grandparents couldn't. Their immigrant grandparents benefited from the GI Bill if they fought in the war that my grandparents couldn't. So part of why I didn't just make an argument for the end of slavery, compensating for slavery, but what slavery shape shifted into is because we had programs that the government sponsored that white immigrants, like FHA insurance, could benefit from, but Black Americans could not. So you are part of the system. You inherited your grandparents' home. You inherited your grandparents' business. You inherited their whiteness. So the idea that you're not part of it misunderstands the reality of race in America.
What gives you hope that this conversation can move forward?
I am very optimistic. The one thing, and this is going to sound odd, but the one thing that gives me hope is this administration. And the reason I say that is because for so long, well-meaning white Americans could look at the election of President Obama and say we're post-racial. We've solved this racism thing, so we don't really have to do anything. We as white Americans don't have to do anything. Well, the Trump administration makes it really clear that race matters very much. And if you are a well-meaning individual, you cannot look at what you're seeing coming out of this administration and think racism is gone and think we're post-racial. So I think there's an opportunity for white Americans who might have otherwise been opposed to reparations to say, maybe I'm going to give that a second look. So I'm actually optimistic because of how very bad things are, and they're going to get worse. So to me, it's a silver lining. Or as I talk to my 94-year-old mother who tells me, yeah, things were bad. Things were worse back then. So she's lived through a lot of what we're seeing today. And the reason why I think I don't freak out at what I see today is in doing the preparation for writing, getting to reparations, I became an expert of sorts on the history of Black people in the 20th century. And the things I'm seeing today are things I read about then. So there's nothing new under the sun. We're seeing people snatched off the street. We saw people snatched off the street in the 20th century. So I I understand. I know my students sometimes get disillusioned, and I understand the disillusion, but I think there's hope with people of goodwill, many of whom were in the focus groups, who started opponents, and when they understood the history, their words, not mine, that's just not fair. And I think the typical American is a fairness, equal opportunity person. And what you'll understand after you read my book is there was nothing about equal opportunity for Black Americans once slavery ended.
True, true. Thank you so much, Ms. Dorothy. And as a reminder, please use the Q&A function, audience, at the bottom of your screen. We're going to get to as many questions as we can. If your question is not answered, please email info@metrounitedway.org. So we do have a few audience questions.
Good.
And so anonymous audience member says, how do we include other marginalized and wealth denied people, such as indigenous people and immigrants who pay taxes but don't receive benefit into this conversation? Or do we?
I would argue we don't, because my argument is the government discriminated on the basis of race against Black people, the only people enslaved. After slavery ended, it shapeshifted to other ways to disadvantage Black Americans solely because of their race. With respect to the indigenous Americans, there have been uh, the Indian Claims Commission paid reparations to tribal nations. So there has been some effort at reparative justice for for tribal nations. I will say not enough. And the tribal nations wanted land and they only got cash, right? So there's more work to be done, but that is a separate effort. And with respect to what we see going on with immigrants today, I actually believe in a decade we will have a movement to pay reparations to Hispanic Americans who were kidnapped in the street. I absolutely do, but that should not preempt a conversation about what has happened to Black Americans. And I often find when we talk and we try to center Black American pain, that conversation gets shapeshifted. I gave a talk once about my reparations project, and one person said to me, Dorothy, I can't get on board with your project because there are white Americans in Appalachia who are being disadvantaged. And I said something to the effect of they were not disadvantaged because of their whiteness. They were disadvantaged because of other policies. And it sounds like that's a great project for you to take on. However, my project is about reparative justice for Black Americans being targeted by the government. And it's difficult to remain focused on Black Americans, but that is going to require discipline from all of us.
Who would qualify and how would eligibility be determined?
Great question. I think eligibility is one of those, as you will hear me answer perhaps in some other questions, that's what the commission will study. Because the big issue is it just American descendants of enslaved Africans, or is it all Black people in America? As I talk about in my book, if you're Black in America, you are being disadvantaged. Amadou Diallo was murdered because he looked Black in America, even though he wasn't descendant of enslaved Africans in America. So I believe it should be for all Black Americans, because when sundown towns existed, when it didn't differentiate between those who were descendants of enslaved Africans and those who may have come from a Caribbean country. Again, It's for the commission to decide. I will live and abide by whatever recommendation the commission makes. So even though I might think it should be inclusive, the commission may come up with a different answer, and I will abide by what the commission thinks. But one other thing I want to say, the reason why we even have this eligibility question is because American law created this one drop rule. And they said if you had one drop of black blood, you were therefore black. Well, we know there's no such thing as black blood, right? But it's white supremacy that got us off course with who is black and who is white, that causes us to even be in a discussion about eligibility. So I think when we have the eligibility conversation, we need to also make space for how we got here. And white supremacy treats all Black Americans badly, whether they are descendants of Africans in America or descendants of Africans in other Caribbean countries. But that's a question for the commission. And I know people have very strong feelings, and I think that's fine. That's what the commission is for, because there were strong feelings in all the other commissions that were created and ultimately led to reparations.
We have another anonymous question. Can you talk more about the wealth drain from taxes each year?
Yes. So, let's talk about marriage. We see that Black married couples are more likely to have dual equal wage earners. Both spouses earn roughly equal amounts. This was certainly true in my parents' household. And the reason why I even got to write The Whiteness of Wealth was because as a good daughter who has an LLM in tax, I did my parents' tax returns. And I was working on Wall Street at the time, and my earnings by myself equaled my parents' combined income. My mother was a nurse, my father was a plumber. And under our progressive tax system, the higher the income you make, the higher the rate of tax that applies to your last dollars of income. And I paid more taxes than my parents, but not a lot. And I should have been paying a huge amount more in taxes than my parents because each one of them was making half of what I was making. And I could not figure it out. But I did know that my parents made roughly equal amounts. My father worked for the New York City Housing Authority, so his income would fluctuate depending on how much overtime he made. Some years my father would make more than my mother. Some years my mother would make more than my father, but it was just a few $100. It was never really significant. Well, one day I became a law professor. I never figured it out, by the way. Became a law professor, and I start reading an article that says, how do you know there isn't a race and tax problem if you don't look? I had never before thought that there might be a race and tax problem, but I picked up the phone, called the author of the article, and I said, I'm going to look. And that's when I found out the IRS doesn't publish data by race. So I thought, okay, this is going to be a challenge. But what I did was I reverse engineered it. I read race research and I applied my tax lenses to it. And I came across a Commission on Civil Rights study on the status of Black women. And I saw a line in the study that said roughly 29% of white wives contribute roughly 29% to household income. Black wives contribute roughly 41%. And to the average reader, that would mean nothing. That would say, yeah, we know Black wives tend to work more than white wives. But to the tax expert, it explained my parents' tax returns because we have a joint return where you file with your spouse, and we tend to think the joint return comes with a tax break. But a joint return only comes with a tax break if you are in a household where one person contributes 100% or close to 100% of the income, and the other person is a stay-at-home spouse. You get no benefit from the joint return, and in fact, your taxes go up if you were in a household where both spouses earn roughly equal amounts. And what that research told me is Black households, Black married couples do marriage differently than white married couples. Black married couples are more likely to have, like my parents, these co-equal wage earners, but white married couples are more likely to have a stay-at-home spouse and another spouse that works in the paid labor market. So our tax laws benefit the way white Americans do marriage, but disadvantage the way Black Americans do marriage. So that's just one example. And it's true in how Black Americans do homeownership differently than white Americans. We have different jobs that come with different benefits. White Americans have jobs that come with tax-free benefits that Black Americans don't have. So what I learned is whether we're getting married, whether we're paying for college, whether we're um, working, whether we're buying a home, tax laws disadvantage the way Black Americans engage in the exact same behavior. And that's a function of societal racism. And I talk about this a lot in my book, The Whiteness of Wealth.
What are some suggestions that you have for white people to help support and advocate for wealth equality?
Support reparations, support a commission. When you hear other white Americans say, that's crazy, it doesn't work, tell them to get my book because my book shows four different times when it did work and it wasn't crazy. So I think what white people can do more than anything is be an ally in this reparative justice movement and support a reparations commission. Because we have the research shows that the majority of Black Americans support reparations, and the majority of other racial groups support reparations, but it's white Americans who are the least supportive. So there's more work to be done with the white community, and I think white allies are going to be a better advocate than, say, me.
Thank you. We have another question from an audience member, Mary. You've mentioned that government policies stripped wealth from Black Americans. Can you please describe those policies? I'm familiar with those that prevented wealth accumulation and would appreciate having the knowledge of how wealth was actually stripped.
So eminent domain is one way wealth was stripped. So in terms of some background, we may be familiar with Bruce's Beach in California, where the Bruce's descendants got California to pass a bill to give them property back that had been stripped from their ancestors, Charles and Willa Bruce. So Charles and Willa Bruce in the 20th century bought land and created a haven of Black joy in California. And what their haven was a beach, and it was uh, like a hotel, so people could come and they could enjoy the beach. Well, before they opened, the Klan tried to burn it down, and it didn't work. And the neighbors, the white neighbors, did not want Black people there. So they tried to run them out, putting up signs, 10-minute parking, you can't walk here. Nothing worked. The state and local government passed a law of eminent domain where they took the property, they paid a nominal amount, they took the property and said, we need it for a park. Because eminent domain says you can take private property if you have a pressing public need. Well, they took it for a park, ostensibly, that was never created for 30 years. So that was just a hoodwink to take Black property from a Black property owner and give them very little wealth for it. So that's one example of how wealth was stripped. Another example is Black farmers lost their land in large part because of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's policies of not giving them loans, of denying them equal access that their white farmers had. And that's been estimated to, be huge. Millions and millions of dollars were lost because Black farmers had their farms stripped away. And again, I talk about this in part two of getting to reparations. Sundown towns were an example where you weren't allowed to buy in that area, weren't allowed to live in that area, which prevented you from forming wealth. as well. But black stripping, another instance where it was very common for wealth to be stripped from black Americans, was lynching. People have this understanding of lynching was, oh, because some of the most famous cases were about black men being accused of assaulting white women. That really wasn't what lynching was about. Study after study after study shows lynching was about white Americans being jealous that black Americans owned a farm, owned a home, owned property, and they would be lynched. And then the white mob who lynched them, one of those mob members would wind up owning the property. So if you really want to understand what lynching is about, look at the land theft and the property theft that resulted from it. If you burn a cross on somebody's home and you run them out of town, there's nobody there to defend that home. So the person who burned the cross gets to move into the home and take over that wealth. So there are a myriad of ways that white supremacy was used to strip black wealth away from black Americans.
Absolutely. So I would say to the audience, most certainly go get Professor Brown's new book that was just released January 20th. I thank you so much for this conversation, Professor Brown. Very important. And I think you're speaking the language of equity very well. Your work challenges us to think honestly about systems, consequences, and possibility. We're grateful for your time and scholarship. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. I'd like to now introduce Robert Gunn, our Chief Impact and Equity Officer, to share closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Trent, and thank you, Miss Dorothy A. Brown. To everyone in the audience, it is a great day to be alive, and to any of my Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters out there, es un gran día para estar vivo. Miss Brown, I want to say thank you so very much for the time that you spent with us today. I know Trent mentioned it earlier, but throughout your talk and your conversation today, I heard you talking about systems for building wealth. Depending on who's listening today, I think some folks may have heard all your words and heard it as the gospel. I think some other folks may be thinking that they need to learn more or need to hear more. So I would like to offer those friends or anyone on our call today the opportunity to join us for a racial wealth gap simulation. Trent did mention this earlier, but the racial wealth gap simulation for folks who need more information or would even like to have more information, it chronicles the history of America beginning in 1865 through present day. Through that simulation, we walk participants through 13 historical policies that have taken place here in the United States of America. Everything from land policies and sharecropping to the National Housing Act, Social Security Act, as you mentioned, Ms. Brown, the GI Bill, employment discrimination, and voting restrictions as well. So one of the things, the feedback we often get after folks sit through that simulation, the premise of folks just need to do better, do more, or pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's not uncharacteristic for individuals to say to us at the end of that simulation, man, folks in this country may not have even had boots on their feet to begin with. And this is just, again, an opportunity for us to help educate folks. So some of the things that Ms. Brown mentioned today could make more sense. But again, Ms. Brown, thank you. I'm sorry, Ms. Dorothy. I got to put the miss in there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Also, want to say thank you to everyone who participated today, and for all of you all who helped donate our efforts at Metro United Way. We appreciate everything that you do to help us ensure that our community has thriving kids, strong households, and an equitable community. Thank you again to the LG and EKU Foundation